Being a leader, understanding who you're leading, meeting them at their level, and leading them. If I don't know how to organize myself or have challenges to organize myself, then I'm going to have difficulty in starting a task.
Joseph K Muscat, welcome to this episode of the Grow Podcast. Really pleasure to have you on. We planned this quite a few months ago, but we had a bit of a backlog to work through, so it's good to have you here finally.
Well, thank you for having me, Daniel. I've been looking forward to it since we last spoke and having this wonderful day.
Yeah, and it's the first non-Maltese accent that we've had as well. We're on now episode. It's going to be like 16 or 17 episodes in, so it's very, very another milestone for us. But Joseph, you are a neurodiversity inclusivity consultant, right?
Yes.
Correct me if I got your role wrong.
You got it.
But can you share with us kind of how you got to this stage, right, of your career and all the good work that you're doing right now?
Sure. Well, let me give you a bit of a backstory. I mean, I'm originally from Toronto, Canada, more specifically Mississauga, which is a little bit west of Toronto, half an hour in what we call the greater GTA. And I was diagnosed at a very young age with a number of neurodiversities, particularly what is known as a visual processing disorder.
Okay.
So it's visual processing, working memory, which is a executive function, as well as what's the word now? I always forget the word. Visual memory, working memory, and visual motor. There we go, visual motor. So I've always had it from a very young age, and had my trials and tribulations with the education system. Despite that, went on to university, graduated, then went on to college, what I call doing my master's, and was a professional photographer for 20 plus years. And through my years of running my business, I still faced, a lot of challenges and trying to figure that out. And everywhere I went, I couldn't find particular support. And lastly, after moving into Malta and bringing our business here, explored other opportunities and particularly found myself in the workplace where these challenges, despite my best efforts, didn't shine well in the workplace, for the lack of better terms. And I finally came to the point where particularly with working with one director, where I just burnt out and sought help and trying to figure out what to do. And at that point, I came to a realization that there's a huge gap in the workplace in not understanding how to support neurodivergence. So I originally had a 3-year plan. And at that same time point, when I had that breakdown, trying to deal with this director, with this company, and looking back at all of my challenges and seeking professional help, I was suggested that based on what my visual processing disorders are, that perhaps I'm dyslexic, which I've never been diagnosed for. I had a lot of people comment on that. And I've always said, no, I'm not dyslexic. I'm visual motor or working memory and visual perception. And then I went and got my dyslexia, and okay, I'm dyslexic. And I often a bit of caution there. And the reason being is through my research and my homework and getting a better understanding of my neurodiversity, and finally embracing it, that's a bit of a funny story as well, is the aspect of researching that quite often visual perception or visual processing disorder it quite often gets misdiagnosed as being dyslexic.
Okay.
Because there's a lot of similarities, and they're two different things. Visual perception, to give you the explanation now.
Yes, please.
Visual perception is being able to interpret what I see. Visual motor is the ability to replicate what I see in a motor skill. So let's say if you were a lecturer and I was copying notes from the whiteboard or projector or what have you, I may not copy fully because I have difficulty in replicating what I'm seeing to my motor skills.
Okay.
And then, of course, working memory. Working memory relates in particular there's more than just working memory. It's a whole executive function dynamic. But working memory is the aspect in regards to how you process information being given to you. So such as following a list of instructions, recalling that information and being able to follow it in a particular order. Working memory tends to break down when we take a look at working memory versus long-term memory or short-term memory. So it's being able to manage that working memory and what kind of supports would I need in regards to that working memory. So when we take a look at that versus dyslexia is an issue with decoding. Being able to decode language, as well as not only decoding the language that you see, but also decoding the language that you hear. And there are similarities, but there's difference. So I always say to people, I'm 50% dyslexic because I'm not too sure if I'm dyslexic, even though I still see a lot of dyslexic traits. So there might still be dyslexic, because now we're talking about, in this aspect, what we call co-occurrence.
Does dyslexia run on a spectrum as well? So
Absolutely.
I'm very uneducated on the dyslexia.
Absolutely. I mean, I quite often, when I talk to people, I ask, can you name me the different types of dyslexia they are? And they all look at me funny going, it's just dyslexia. No, no, it's a spectrum. There are 6 different types of dyslexia.
Okay.
And mine actually follows around the 2nd or 3rd type dyslexia.
Right.
So again, is there's a lot of similarities? Is it dyslexia, or is there a co-occurrence? So when we talk about co-occurrences, we're talking about where an individual has more than one type of neurotype. So in my case, I'm visual perception, visual motor, and dyslexic. Somebody else could be autistic, ADHD, has Tourette's. So there's a lot of those co-occurrences.
Okay. Yeah. So what I've seen is that ADHD and autism go hand in hand sometimes. So there is quite a bit of a link between the two. So that's okay. So now it makes sense what you're saying.
Yeah. And when we
say co-occurrence, now I understand what you mean.
Yeah, exactly. And when we take a look at percentages, what is it? 40% or 60% of autistics have ADHD.
Okay.
40 to 60%, somewhere around that ballpark, ADHDers have autism.
Okay.
And the same thing could be said about 30 to 40% of ADHDers have dyslexic, and vice versa.
Okay. So now you're doing this full time, right? Where you're consulting with organizations and companies to, I guess, educate, right? Educate,
bring awareness, do workshops, take a look at how inclusive their policies and procedures are, and even put aside policies and procedures. Let's take a look at how inclusive the culture is. Understanding that there are different types of neurotypes within an organization, and how, as an organization, as an employer, as a fellow employee or manager, how are you managing that? How are you understanding that? How are you providing support? Where is there the conflicts that happen? Because obviously in a workplace, there's a checkbox system. You're supposed to fit in this box, and you're supposed to check all the boxes. And when you don't, there's these clashes that happen.
What is the usual reception you get? So when you sit in a room of people leaders, right, and you start talking about neurodivergence, what is the usual reaction? And I would probably split this question into two points, right? What's the usual reaction in big organizations? Because big organizations tend to be more open to this kind of information or education coming through. And what's the reaction in smaller companies?
That's a very good question. I would say reality is that they're both open. Okay. They're both looking at how they can utilize their cultures and teams more effectively. With that said, there are obviously particular challenges to take into account. Now, it depends on who you're talking about, who you're talking to, should I say, and where their mindset is. If their mindset is in being people-focused, then they're very open, they're very receptive, and they're looking at what they can do to bring change. If their mindset is more of a commodity aspect, where they look at their employees as a commodity, or looking more at the bottom line. Let's be honest, employers tend to look more at the bottom line and the numbers.
Especially recently,
more so than they look at people and their company. Then it's like, well, this is very interesting, but now's not a good time for us. When I first started 3 years ago, I met with an organization where our focus is on mental health, because it was in the midst of COVID. And I said to him, that's great, but you do realize that you're looking at it from the end of it rather than looking at the beginning of it.
Yeah.
you're being retroactive, and you're not realizing that the retroactive aspect is due to causes and understanding one's neurotype that is resulting into that mental health crisis. And so what are you doing to be more proactive? And 3 years later, the attitude's still the same.
Okay,
so
that's interesting.
Now, when we take a look at larger organizations versus smaller organizations, a lot of smaller organizations feel that they're just too small. They don't have the resources as bigger organizations, which really isn't the case. When we take a look at bigger organizations, yeah, they have resources, but there's also a lot of bureaucracy. And that bureaucracy gets in the way of doing that change. Smaller organizations are more robust. They're able to adapt and change and be more receptive. And the HR is just down the hall versus 3 floors down or 3 floors up.
The hierarchy is relatively flat compared to bigger organizations.
So it's much more easier to go and have that conversation or say, let's implement this change much faster.
Yeah.
Right? So this is where I disagree with the smaller organizations. It's a mindset. If you're really people focused and understanding, I mean, the research is out there. The HR employers who read the research, who are advocates in understanding on how to improve their business, already know this, that the more people-centric your organization is, the more training that you give your managers, and providing the resources to support your staff and to nurture that people-centric culture, the better your productivity is. So when we take a look at research and we see a manager who barks orders versus a manager who has a more people-centric approach, that manager who has a more people-centric approach has a more productive, robust team versus the manager who barks orders. And a manager who barks orders has high turnover and productivity's down. So the research is out there. What's the hurdle? It's mindset. The willingness to make change. When I do presentations, sometimes I hear from a lot of people that this is a lot of work and it's difficult. Yeah. Well, why is it difficult? It starts with the mindset, from my opinion. Yes, there are particular facets in place that will make it difficult, but what are you doing to advocate and to move the needle forward rather than being in the stalemate situation?
And from my experience, I completely agree with what you've said so far. From my experience, most of the people tend to turn away from such initiatives and such changes because it does take time. This is not a 3-month project, right? It's something that usually takes years to construct, especially in bigger companies and bigger organizations. From my experience, again, obviously this is just my perspective, but it does take years to build.
It does.
Solid, robust people structures that are considerate and can be efficient at the same time. Because I've also seen, in my experience, people. I forgot exactly what you called it, but people-focused structures going too much on the people focus and then forget about the bottom line. So there needs to be a mixture of the two, where performance and accountability is still weaved in. The people-centric, that's the word you use, the people-centric approach, right? And people, not people, but a lot of leaders struggle to find that balance in the two, between the two, right? So they're like, I don't want to be too nice to my guys because then they won't do any work. I was like, that's not what people-centric means. People-centric is you give people the tools, and also then you train them how to use those tools, and you give the leaders the right support to shift their mindset, etc. But then there is, and there's the but bit, which is performance is still something that needs to be, because at the end of the day, you are still running a business. There needs to be certain requirements that you need to achieve. So it's finding the balance between the two.
Without a doubt, I completely agree with everything you're saying. Look, by no means am I saying that you forget about the business. That's preposterous. All right, and if that's what the conclusions that you're jumping into and reading into what I'm saying, then you're not really paying attention to what I'm saying. Look, I'm a capitalist. Okay, I've run businesses. I like to make money. I like to support my lifestyle. All right, so there obviously needs to be focus on producing your KPIs, your turnovers, and so forth. That's without question. All right. And, you know, it reminds me of conversations I've had with leaders where they get to this kind of point and they say, well, look, at the end of the day, they need to do their jobs. Yeah. I said, that's not the question. And that's not the issue. All right. Of course, they need to do their jobs. They need to get paid for what they've been hired for. That's not what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. What I am saying is, what are the barriers that are in place that are interfering with their ability to do their job, to produce those KPIs, to get to the bottom line that they want equally as you do, because they obviously want to get paid for their salary, right?
And they want something that's rewarding as well, right?
Exactly. Yeah. They want something rewarding as well. So that's not... When I have these kind of conversations, you can tell that they lack the depth in understanding what the real subject matter is.
And I find that personally the same, right? So when I'm having, so I'm a big people structure advocate in terms of, you know, hiring the right people, but also giving them the right environment to work in, right? You know, collaborative, not the barking orders type, you know, as you said, like there's not too much expectation, not too much expectation, but like, you know, there's not too much chaos. There is some form of structures, there is some form of handover that people can kind of not have to worry if they've taken a couple of days off, right?
Yeah.
So they can just go and relax and all that stuff. But as you said, it is sometimes just that the mindset is completely different. If it's like, oh yeah, but if I'm too soft on my people, they're not going to, because that's how people feel, right? I'm not, so it's a common, I think it's a common barrier between consultants, because that's the first thing, like, that's not what I'm telling you, that's not what I'm trying to say.
Exactly.
There's a balance in between the two that you need to find, and
right.
I'm here to support it. Right?
And it's not about being too soft. I think that's completely wrong.
Yeah.
It's about being a leader.
Exactly.
All right? Being a leader, understanding who you're leading, meeting them at their level, and leading them. All right? And that sometimes leadership can come soft, sometimes leadership can come hard. Sometimes leadership is a balance between the two. But at the end of the day, it's about being a leader. And if you cannot delegate that or negotiate that within your style, then perhaps, let's be honest, you're not ready to take a leadership role, or you need more training in how to be a leader. And coming back, I want to come back a little bit to something you said earlier, that it takes time. Look, it definitely takes time. There's no doubt about that. And this is where we kind of get into what I call the training myth and the time myth, all right? Where you send somebody for training and you expect the zero to hero approach, where this person who's going for additional training, or you feel that they need more training in a particular area, they take a 3-month course and you expect them to go from 20% to 100%. That's not reality. When that person comes from the training, they may only increase by 5%. They may increase by 20%. And then there's also a maturity aspect, all right? That maturity aspect may take 3 to 6 months to a year. And let's say in a 6-month period where they've gone from 20%, end of the course they go from 5%, and then by the 6-month period, then there's that leap from 25% to now 30, 40, 50%. You have to give that maturity aspect. So when we come back to making change, it's taking these baby steps. It's understanding that there's going to be a percentage of change. What that percentage of change is going to look like, visualizing and self-actualizing, saying this is what our goal is and this is what we want to have for what that percentage is going to be like. And then understanding that once you get to that percentage, there's going to be some time for that maturity to take place. So when we take a look at change, we have to follow that methodology and understand that approach and structure. So, you know, and then when you get to that certain percentage, you know, whether you've reached it or not, because sometimes you may not reach it, you have to take a look at why you didn't reach it and what can you do to start reaching it, right? Rather than saying it didn't work, you know, this is a waste of time, you know, waste of time, money and resources, you know, and it's not hitting our bottom line. You know, it takes time. And if you're willing to make that investment and understand what the outcome really is going to be, because when we talk about inclusion in workplaces, right? Employers who have you are looking at the numbers, all right? And they're expecting what those numbers are going to be like. Well, they have to understand that that requires a maturity time point to see those numbers. If you're expecting it within 3 months, you're setting everybody up, including yourself, to a huge disappointment.
Yeah.
All right.
3 months is a very small data pool, isn't it?
Yeah, but we'll be honest, businesses tend to look at it that way, right?
Yeah.
We're going to start including neurodivergent people. So, but in 3 months' time, we're going to see productivity greatly increase. Really? Come on.
No. Yeah, absolutely. I think for me, like the biggest number that businesses should start looking at first is turnover, employee turnover. Get that down first, and then you can start focusing on every other KPI, right? Because when you aim to get down turnover, automatically you are putting people initiatives in the bloodstream of the business, right?
Yeah.
Without even wanting you, because you'd be like, right, so why are people leaving? Oh, because their manager is not treating them well, right? So we need to give our managers better training.
Yeah.
Or they don't feel that their onboarding process was good enough. So let's fix their onboarding. Let's make them feel more welcome. Let's give them more training that is inclusive, introduce them to more of the team. So then you've got the inclusivity aspect. Maybe the job is too much, so let's reevaluate our KPIs and our targets to make them more adaptable to people, like, give grace periods, etc.
That's precisely it. And building on that, what you're talking about is the hidden numbers, right? When we talk about turnover, absenteeism, presenteeism.
Yeah.
And there was a study last year or 2 years ago from EUC Sinclair, which I think it was a European study, which then focused on Malta and the Times of Malta, Malta Today, did a summary on the reports. When we take a look at the numbers, turnover is about 19 million. Turnover is about 19 million. Absenteeism is about 24 million. And presenteeism in Malta, but when you compare the numbers Europe-wise, presenteeism is always the largest out of the three.
What is presenteeism?
Basically showing up to work sick. All right?
Right.
And when we say showing up to work sick, sickness comes in many aspects. You're showing up with the flu, or you're showing up burnt out, right? Or showing up with a mental health crisis.
Yeah. That is common.
It's very common. and to be honest, when we take a look at situations where people are forced to come into work, or they feel that they have to come into work, especially when we take a look at neurodivergents who are overcompensating because they're afraid of being found out or stigma or what have you. And they, productivity-wise, they're only working at 20-30%, right? Rather than working at the full 80 to 100% because of this presenteeism aspect. And when we take a look at the numbers, that's 56 million. So that's 19 million costing overall Maltese businesses. That's 24 million costing overall Maltese businesses. And that's 56 million costing overall Maltese businesses. So when we take a look at being proactive and being more inclusive to neurodivergent talent, again, we're talking about ADHD, dyslexic, Tourette's, autism, dyscalculia, development coordination disorder, development language disorder, visual processing disorder. Those are all falls in the umbrella of neurodivergency. And we're looking at what can we do to, when we take a look at those overall numbers, 19, 24, 56 million, we have to take into account what percentage of that is neurodivergent. Right? So let's say the 56 million of presenteeism. Overall, statistically, globally, it's become the standard, 20% is neurodivergent. So we have to take away 20% out of 56 million who are neurodivergent. That's 20% out of 56 million who are coming to work burnt out through presenteeism or what have you. Then we also have to take a look into, which I put into question, is it 20%? Because we have a huge number of undiagnosed neurodivergents. That huge number of undiagnosis can be within the 20%, or it can also be outside that 20%. So are we really looking at 30%? Are we looking at 40% out of 56 million? And to make those numbers a little bit more tangible for the listeners, when we say 20%, the statistically numbers is 20 employees, 4 out of 20 are neurodivergent. So again, that's 20%. So if we add another 10 or 20, another 20% on top of that, that means it could be 8 out of 20 or 10 out of 20.
Big number.
That's a big number of your population. And it's also taken into account as well that When we talk about 20% out of 4 out of 20, we're looking at 4 out of 20 customers. We're talking about 4 out of 20 business owners and 4 out of 20 employees.
That's a really that's a really interesting bit of figures that you threw at me there, because it makes it I think it's undervalued or not looked at through that lens, right? And going back to my where this conversation started, if you start looking at how your people show up or not show up for work, that's probably like your first go-to point, right? And fixing that number, because people who are numbers based will still be looking at numbers. Fixing that number is usually the underlying, like the first piece of the puzzle, because then everything else can follow, in my opinion. And I've seen this happen in multiple initiatives that I've done, either been part of or led or been part of leading over the last couple of decades, that it's always the case. If you make people want to come into work more, everything else tends to fall in line fairly quickly over the next few months, or depends on obviously how the operations run. But very, very good start to the podcast. I think we've gone into a lot of detail. I'm just going to rewind back a bit,
Sure.
and because obviously what I want to do in this particular episode is as neurodivergents, I'm going to call myself one as well, because of we talked about it recently. I got my ADHD diagnosis. Not that I didn't know about it, but I got it officially said to me finally. What are the common misconceptions about neurodivergent individuals throughout? Let's use it in the workplace and not in day-to-day life, because I think, as someone who's had ADHD for a long time now, it all makes sense once you get told, and and it's a very lengthy process. There's no, it takes a while until you're told, yes, you are actually on the ADHD spectrum or whatever. But what are the common misconceptions about neurodivergence? And I think maybe to answer this question better, we could probably split the most common neurodivergencies, and maybe you can walk us through that, right? What do you think? How do you want to do it?
Well, let's peel the onion a little bit more, okay? Let's first take a look at the aspect when we talk about one's neurodiversity, or neurodivergence, should I say? Let's first explain those two terms before we go any further, because neurodiversity. How can I say this, or explain this properly? Language is fun, and a lot of people don't realize language is evolving.
Yep.
Right, and there are many terminologies in that evolution of language. So I use neurodiversity because it's become the mainstream term. All right. And in the neurodiversity community, there is huge objections to that. Because to understand that, we have to understand the explanation. So the term neurodiversity means all of us, the whole world population, falls in the umbrella of being neurodiversity, because we all think and you perform uniquely differently.
Yeah.
Now, there is the majority type of diversity, which is known as neurotypicals, or I call neuromajority, okay? Which is what our current systems are based on in education, in society, in the workplace, and so forth. And then, of course, there's the group of individuals who fall outside of the neuromajority, which is known as neurodivergence, because they're diverging away from the majority neurotype as well as from neurodiversity. And again, those are traditionally been known as learning disabilities. Dyslexia, ADHD, autism, dyscalculia, developmental language disorder, developmental coordination disorder, visual perception, visual motor, and so forth. And Tourette's. Now, that's the first camp. The second camp, I don't focus so much on. It's not my area of expertise, let's say.
Okay.
But there is a second camp. And it's important to recognize the second camp. Because when we talk about neurodivergence, we are talking about a neurological development in the brain. It's a natural neurological development. And to put that in more simpler terms, we have people with different eye colors, different hair colors. We have short people, we have tall people, we have wide people, we have thin people. So from a physical perspective, we can see a wide variety of different types of people. So it only makes sense that we have different eye colors, then we have different brain types.
Yeah.
So that's where the neurological development comes into play. So when we take a look at the second camp, that falls in the aspect of individuals who have obsessive compulsive disorder, schizophrenia, bipolar, Arlene syndrome, post-traumatic stress, chronic traumatic stress, Down syndrome. That's the second camp. Okay? As I said earlier, I don't focus on the second camp, but it does need to be recognized. I'm more focused on the first camp, which is traditionally known as learning disabilities. Now, you coming to your question now, giving that
that's
explanation.
Good context. Yeah.
Okay. Coming to your question. Yes, the focus is on the workplace, but let's not kid ourselves. One's neurodiversity impacts their personal life, their professional life, their everyday life. So we have to recognize it's a mixture of that. And we also have to recognize the aspect that the myth that you don't bring your personal life to work, it's a myth. You always do. And the work in itself, it's its own separate culture. So when we take a look at particular challenges, let's first take a look at the stigma. From an early age, coming back into education, there has been this stigma in regards to how neurodivergents learn and perform differently due to their neurotype in education system. And that then leads into mental health challenges. They're masking in the education system. They don't want to tell their peers because of stigma. They have developed learned helplessness. They develop anxiety. They develop a low self-esteem. There are individuals who obviously develop a high self-esteem. They're overachievers. But eventually at some point, unless they've been able to figure out how to manage it well, there is going to be a breakdown. And then this carries on into post-secondary and then into their professional lives. So we have to take a look at those aspects. Now, when we take a look at different types of neurotypes, what can affect somebody? It could be the environment. ADHD, autistic individuals have a heightened sensitivity to their environment. They also have a different way of how they socialize and how they interpret socialization and people skills and language and so forth. We take ADHDers also tend to have a bit of that problem as well in relation to how they interpret things or environmental situations and being sensitive to lighting and sound and so forth. So there's an environmental impact as well as the mental health impact. Then comes the aspect where we talk about executive function. Now, when we talk about executive function, you cannot talk about neurodivergence without talking executive function. The two are married together.
What's the term, sorry?
Executive function.
Second of function.
Executive.
Executive function.
Executive function.
Because you're saying it really quick.
Sorry. I'll try to slow down.
No, that's okay. Executive function. Yes. So I've heard about executive dysfunction in ADHD.
Yes.
So that's interesting. Sorry.
The dysfunction, medical term, which brings up another point.
Okay.
So when we take a look at society in general and we take a look at neurodivergence, there's a clash, let's say it, or a difference of approach. Medical model versus the social model. When we take a look at the medical model, the focus has always been on what's wrong with this child with ADHD. Why do they have ADHD? How can we cure ADHD? When we take a look at the social model, again, it comes back to it's not dysfunction. It's a natural neural development. So up until this point, I've been speaking in terms of from a social model rather than a medical model. So yes, when I say visual processing disorder, it's a medical term. Or when you said executive dysfunction, that's a medical term, looking at what's wrong with it rather than realizing it's a neurotype development from a social model and accepting and understanding and being more inclusive to that ideology. Because in reality, it is. There's no cure for autism. You're not going to cure autism. It's a natural development. So we need to remove that attitude and that stigma from the language and behavior and mindset. So when we take a look at executive I'm about to say dysfunction.
It's okay.
Executive function. Thank you. Executive function. When we talk about neurodivergency, and we talk about executive function, it's about understanding the brain. Because that's, again, coming from that aspect, understanding something that we can't see. Mm-hmm. We can understand short people, tall people, to people with different eye colors, because we're judging it on physical aspects rather than something that you can't see. So when we take a look at from the brain, executive function is the last part of the brain to develop. The brain develops from the back to the front. And executive function is actually located right here in the front, with the frontal lobe. And it's the last part to develop. And when we say the last part to develop, for everybody, regardless if you're neurodivergent or not, it's not fully developed until approximately 25 to 30 years of age. All right? Now, that part of the brain is responsible for what we do for everyday tasks. So getting up in the morning, getting dressed, making yourself breakfast, driving your car, those are all executive function skills. So when we take a look at executive functions, there's quite a number of them. We're looking at self-regulation. We're looking at memory. We're looking at organization. We're looking at self-regulation. We're looking at task initiation. These are all a variety of executive function skills. So let's break that down into everyday tasks. So let's take a look at organization. When we take a look at organization, it's the ability to organize one's thoughts, the ability to organize your laundry or your paperwork at work, your ability to organize your priority list, which then leads into priorities. That's an executive function challenge as well. What's a priority? Is this a priority or is that a priority? Which one do I need to do first? Where do I start? Which then goes into a task initiation. So you notice I started with organization, all right? Organization then leads into organizing priorities. Then priorities leads into where do I start? If I don't know how to organize myself, or I have challenges to organize myself, and I have challenges in prioritization, then I'm going to have difficulty in starting a task. These are all executive function challenges that happen in everyday life and in the workplace.
I've got all of them, by the way. I've been just tick boxing in my head. Like something I use the joke, I procrastinate too close to the sun.
Right.
And then when it's like crunch time, but then when it's crunch time, I can get down and do stuff.
Typical
very quickly.
ADHD.
Yeah.
But your procrastination is because of your executive function challenges. Your inability to say this, to organize, your inability to be able to prioritize. And then you're looking at this and like, I'm overwhelmed. I don't know where to start, how to start. How am I going to be able to complete this? So then procrastination comes into play. And that then when we take a look, I often say that procrastination is fear. You're afraid of what to do and how to do it because you don't know how to manage that or you have difficulty in knowing how to manage that.
And I've been lucky to learn through my career ways to avoid that, right? So I'm very disorganized naturally, but I'm very organized now in my mid-30s because I've learned to, if something comes up, just put it in the calendar. If something comes up, and my calendar is my life. Like if it's not there, it doesn't exist. Like if it's not on the calendar, it's not happening.
That's one of the things I coach. Learn 100%. To master your calendar.
Yeah. But I have, my calendar is usually full with slots, including break times if I need to do something, especially when I used to work full time. But if it's not there, it's not happening for me. And it's now become a common thing where I forget to put it down on the calendar, and then the moment comes and somebody messages me and I'm like, oh, by the way, we were supposed to meet. I'm like, oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's happened to me as well. Did you
send me the invite? No, so it's not happening.
Yeah, exactly.
It does not exist.
Exactly. You're reimagining some of the hiccups that I have had in regards to my calendar. So I totally.
Yeah. But only now do I realize why I've put myself habitually and maybe I'm wrong here, but I've been doing a lot of reading about ADHD in the past month and a half or so, and it does say that habit forming is very, very important if you are neurodivergent in ADD or ADHD, because it really helps you get get started with things, especially like brushing your teeth and stuff like that. Like you can, if you don't have that habit instilled, like a normal human being would go and do, well, normal, but a neurotypical would go and do it. Like if you don't have the habit of doing it, you just won't do it.
Yeah.
And I think back to my childhood where I wouldn't, I would forget to eat. I just not eat for a couple of days. It's happened in my teens, especially when I got into like World of Warcraft initially. It's,
that's it though. You mentioned in the aspect of developing structure and routine. Yeah. This is a very important tool for neurodivergence. With that said though, there's difficulty in being able to form that structure and routine due to one's neurotype. And again, I'm sure you have as well, as much as I have read numerous self-help books or have communicated with friends and family who said, well, just do this. This is how I do it. So, follow my plan.
Just don't overthink.
Yeah,
it's fine.
Just don't overthink. Just follow my routine and you'll be able to do it. But we think and perform differently. Yeah. And what comes easy to them due to their neurotype, they have a hard time understanding that it doesn't come easy to us to our different neurotypes. And it becomes challenging for us to develop those routines and structures. And of course, you may start off with a routine that you've developed and then you fall off the wagon because for whatever reason, it's not working for you. And then you say, okay, this didn't work. Let's move on to another tried, tested routine that somebody recommended. And when that happens, it's looking back and saying, okay, it's not that it didn't work. It's just I need to figure out why it didn't work and how I can make it work for me. How can I make it work for my brain, my neurotype, my neurodivergence?
Yeah, and I think it goes to say, I think the same approach should be done by everyone, right? It doesn't matter if you are on the neurodivergence or the neurotypical spectrum. In general, even like if we go something as common as a fitness routine, it took me 2.5 years to find something I actually enjoy doing and like look forward to going to do, right? I needed to get fit, right? If I wanted to live longer. So there's that push, right? Okay, so you get the drive that you want to change something, but you need to experiment and figure out what is the best routine or something that you look forward to doing to be able to eventually form that habit.
Right. I agree with what you said. Word of caution, though.
Okay.
And the word of caution is, yes, everybody has to go through that routine. But take into account that neurodivergents, they have to go through a much more extra effort. And when I say extra, I mean extra effort, because their brain development is different.
Right. Okay.
Right. It is different. And when we say that everybody goes through this, it kind of normalizes it. And by normalizing it, I know this wasn't your intention, but
no, it's okay.
It kind of downplays the difficulties that neurodivergents have to go through. It downplays the challenges where there now comes into masking and overcompensating, leading into burnout. I mean, there are neurodivergents who have suicidal thoughts and attempt suicide because of these challenges, because of the attitude of just do it. This worked for me, so it should work for you. When we take a look at the self-help books or the gurus out there who say do it my way, well, yeah, it worked for you. It works for the neurotypical neuromajority who follows that plan, but it doesn't necessarily apply to someone who's neurodivergent. And we also have to take a look at the aspect. Okay, I don't like the aspect that I don't like the term disability. Okay. As much as I don't like the term disability, I still have to say disability, because if I don't say disability, then I'm not going to get the support and recognition that I need in the aspect that the workplace is or society is designed for the neuromajority and it's not designed for me. So then no, I won't get the accommodations. Because I see what you mean. Because it's not because I don't want it to be recognized as a disability. I would much prefer a nice flat world, but the reality is it's not flat.
It's not. That's right.
So I also would like to remove the whole terminology of disability. But if I do that, then I run into problems that I've been trying to avoid.
No, that makes a lot of sense, because I think obviously not all of them, because you did say that there are two kind of types of neurodivergence. Or I don't know exactly what words you use, so I'm sorry if
I call them Group A, Group B.
Yeah, so Group A and Group B, right?
Quite often I'll have people ask me, you said the Group A is learning disabilities. What's the name of Group B? There is no name. I don't have a name for it. It's Group A.
So, and again, this could be from a point of ignorance, but like, so for example, somebody with schizophrenia, right? For example, who's in Group B, and somebody who's in Group A with ADHD, you can consider both learning disabilities if you want to use that terminology. Yes, but somebody with ADHD has more likelihood to be able to integrate within the societal structure than somebody with schizophrenia who needs. And again, it could be from a point of ignorance. So correct me, please, if I'm wrong.
I'm going to stop you there.
Okay. Yeah.
Because I'll use your language. It is a point of ignorance. There's an interesting BBC. I have a contact in the UK who does mental health first aid training, and she introduced me to this lovely BBC video in regards to where they have people who are schizophrenic. Answer and what's what I'm looking for. Remove the myths about schizophrenia. And there are a lot of myths about schizophrenia. The individuals with schizophrenia are just like you and me. They have everyday normal lives. And I'm sure up until this point, I've most likely had the same attitude. Up until the point that I saw this video, I had the same attitude that you had of what schizophrenia looked like, right?
Interesting. I'm writing it down now, so we'll try and include the link in the description.
Yeah, I'll find it for you.
Yeah, if you could, that would be great.
Send it to you. In regards to schizophrenia, but and obviously we had this television media view of what schizophrenia is, and it's wrong. It's 100% wrong. They have everyday lives. They're as normal as you and I are. They just have a different neurotype. And of course, there's been this huge negative stigma in regards to schizophrenia. With that said, though, you mentioned ADHD and schizophrenia were both in Camp A and Camp B. There could be co-occurrences. You can have an individual with ADHD who's also schizophrenic, or and we do know for a fact that you'll have autistics who have bipolar or obsessive compulsive disorder. Same thing with ADHD. There are a lot of co-occurrences. And this is a dangerous aspect in the sense of we tend to think that there are silos. This person's ADHD and this person's schizophrenic, and they never touch. They never touch. Yeah. That's how we as human beings like to categorize things, but our brains don't operate in that way. What you think isn't connected actually connects for whatever reason, however the brain works.
That's very interesting. So everything's on a spectrum, pretty much, right?
Yeah.
So no, that's opened my mind up to it. So I would love to watch that video. I used to do mental health first aid courses every year, and it was always astounding, like, and intriguing to look at the various kind of ways you should react. Because as a manager back then, kind of we had to know certain triggers to be able to direct the person in the right direction. Obviously, we weren't by no means psychologists or psychiatrists, but we needed to know the triggers, etc. So I'm going to ask you now a question based on what you do specifically. How can workplaces accommodate neurodivergent employees to be able to leverage the skill sets as well, right? So this is a win-win for both.
Yeah.
Right? So what are the most common prescriptive solutions you provide through training? So if you had to break it down, I don't know, to 5 or 6.
Sure. So first off, you need to start the conversation within the workplace. You need to create a safe atmosphere to talk about neurodivergency. And that has to come from the ground up as well as from the top down. And perhaps having HR being the bridge between the two groups to be able to create this conversation. You need to talk about it in your literature. You need to talk about it at the water cooler. You need to talk about it on your billboards, in your newsletters. You need to create this atmosphere where managers are talking to their staff about neurodivergency, where it's a safe place to have the conversation. it starts off with psychological safety. And psychological safety, by definition, is a safe place to have these types of conversations where I can communicate without being judged or criticized.
Have you seen, so I like the psychological safety aspect. I'm a big fan of it. I've always tried, I think probably that's my most go-to trait as a leader. Whenever I've had teams, the first hurdle I used to remove is just be happy, be able to talk about whatever you want, as long as it's not offensive to everyone else. So make sure that everyone's comfortable, that you can come to me and give me feedback as your manager and all that stuff, right? If we had to look at because we both work with local businesses, right? I'm guessing that the majority of your clients are local.
Yes, I have a mixture of local and international.
Right, but with local clients, particularly in Malta, is there psychological safety? Like, can you honestly say that? Because I don't want to impact your bias or your response, but from what I've seen, psychological safety so far is very, very limited.
I would agree.
Yeah, the environment seems to be way too volatile. Maybe it could be just because of us Maltese and our passion and the way we kind of it's just our culture, right? But so that's the question. Have you seen a lack of psychological safety?
Definitely. The aspect of psychological safety is definitely a challenge here in Malta. And it will vary from organization to organization. There are a number of aspects to why this is. Nepotism, family-run organizations. I mean, a lot of Maltese businesses are family-run. And again, it comes down from a top-down approach in regards to how they view how their company should be run. So it becomes a challenge. And I'm sure you've equally heard similar stories where there is a boardroom in a meeting where they're talking about one topic or the other, and the majority of people don't speak up.
Yeah.
Because why? Because most likely when they have spoken up in the past, they were shot down.
I was going to say that most likely these people would have spoken up in the past, but...
And they were shut down, right? And their ideas were not valued and flourished, right? And you also have a situation where leaders tend to talk to rather than listen. So when you have that kind of situation, there's a clear indication that it's not psychologically safe.
Yep.
You want, the rule is 90-10. You speak 10% of the time and you listen 90% of the time. And you listen to all the ideas. So there's an example of a leader, not here locally, but internationally wise, whose name I can't recall, where she would sit back, speak 10% and sit back and listen and hear what everyone else has to say, good or bad. And then from there, summarize what everybody has said, and then take a look and contemplate and saying, okay, this is the direction that we need to move into. And this is a good idea. You should lead this and that and so forth. That is where leadership should come into place. Mm-hmm. And that's where psychological safety comes with. You want to hear ideas. You want to be curious. You want to question. And is that an issue? Just from a cultural perspective, and then I'll lead into some information. But from a cultural perspective, my wife and I and a few other of our expat colleagues, or our fellow immigrants to Malta, we kind of look and go, we've become more aggressive since living in Malta. Because Malta's
it's just culture.
The Maltese culture is very aggressive.
Mm-hmm.
That is a critique. You can accept it or not accept it.
I think it's a fact in any Mediterranean country that we are just shorter fused.
It's shorter fused, and we found ourselves becoming shorter fused. And so this leads into be brave, and I like to mention be brave because we're talking about psychological safety, and we're also talking about in regards to particular challenges in regards to neurodiversity within the workplace. Be Brave is Malta's NGO for bullying. And last year, I had the pleasure of being asked and invited to be one of their consultants in the first ever study done in Malta in regards to workplace bullying. And I provided the oversight or consultation, should I say, in regards to this. Some of the figures coming out. Let's take a look at it from a neurodivergent perspective now. And one of the things that had come out from the study, which was very interesting, we also had a particularly interesting focus group, because when we talk about neurodivergency, we're also talking about people with disabilities. Okay, so let's first take a look at the stats. The stats stated that 69% of individuals who said they were bullied because of work performance. So,
what a great way to encourage that person to do better, right?
What a great way, right? But let's read in between the lines now.
Yeah.
69% are bullied because of work performance, work-related issues is the exact terminology from the study. What percentage of that is neurodivergent? Now, as we established earlier in our conversation, we know 20%, right? Yeah. Then we also know that there's an unknown number of undiagnosed, which then comes into, is it 20 or is it 40% out of 69, or is it more? So there's a clear indication that there are neurodivergents within the workplace who are facing particular challenges in regards, and particularly in towards bullying. And then comes back to the conversation of psychologically safe. It's obviously not psychologically safe to be neurodivergent if you're being bullied for work-related reasons. When we go to the focus group, you can hear individuals who are neurodivergent and people who are with disabilities saying that there's no such thing as inclusion. They don't want inclusion. They don't want us in the workplace. You know, we're constantly being pushed out. Even the aspect from Maltese law, 'cause now we need to talk about Maltese law a little bit, where they're supposed to meet a 20% quota of their individuals of being neurodivergent, and it's much more cheaper to pay the fine. Or you have instances, which was really shocking to find out from the study, where an employer who sees where there's an issue of a person with disability or neurodivergent being bullied, instead of facing any kind of legal action, they pay them off. So what a way to change your workplace and to create a culture of inclusion and psychological safety. What a way of not doing that, and just pay off the employee, the person with disability or neurodivergent, and send them away, rather than giving them a career and a stable salary. It says a lot.
Yeah, it's crazy.
It's crazy. It's disgusting, frankly.
So it's absolutely. So there's the legislative barrier. There's the cultural barrier. Is there any other big barriers that
well, look, the big barrier, what I find is a number of aspects. First off, managers. Managers need more training, particularly frontline managers. They're the ones who are the center of their team as a culture within the workplace. And if the managers, the manager has a lot of pressure. They need to make sure everybody reaches their KPIs. They make sure the deliverables are delivered. We get that. We're not denying that needs to be done. With that said, if the manager doesn't have people skill training, is not people-centric, and does not understand neurodivergency, then how can they support their employees to meet that particular pressure that is required of them?
I would even take it an extra step that people-centric managing skills are part of good performance managing skills.
Absolutely.
In general, right?
In general. But they're not being trained that. That's the issue.
No. And the problem is, so you said frontline managers, I agree with that. But the problem is that if their managers are not trained, they cannot sustain that training. Like you said, right? It doesn't matter if that person's done a 3-month course, because it will take time until they get the 60% efficacy from that. But if the leader, the person on top, the CEO, up to the CEO, is not equally trained, and not just training, because training is just training, right? For me, not that I don't believe in training, but I've always said this, and I say it to my clients as well, I can deliver training for you, but if you're not going to change your mindset, it's a waste of time and money.
Absolutely. And on top of that, if you're not being consistent and following through with that training. I mean, let's take a look. You send your employees to a Tony Robbins seminar. Okay. They come up hype and enthusiastic.
100 grand.
100 grand, but they come hype and enthusiastic of, mindset change. But then a few weeks pass by, a month passes by, and they end up back in that same routine that they were before going to that conference, that training. Why? Because there wasn't follow through. You didn't bring a Tony Robbins consultant a month later to help them follow through on that transition. And that's where a lot of businesses fail to realize that sending to a course is one thing, but if you're not adding that support along the way, then they're going to end up plateauing and coming back to where they are or where they were before.
Do you offer as well, so apart from obviously trainings and seminars as well, do you offer a way where they can have a structured developmental cycle to support that?
Absolutely. Obviously we start off with a workshop and then we offer the additional support follow through. That could be a meeting, that could be coming in, one-on-one coaching with a particular group to facilitate that. But of course, there has to be that want from the company.
And it's a shame because a lot of companies are very, very eager to get the initial training and the initial workshops, but then fail to do the next step, right? So you've just wasted everyone's time.
Absolutely. Well, let's take a look at it
in the long run.
Let's take a look from a different perspective. I'm going to bring up in Canada, we have a program on TVO, which is similar to government public broadcasting. And there's a great program, which is a editorial show called Agenda. And they bring in intellectuals about various topics about change. And they have brought somebody from the UK who studied in what's happening in Singapore. And when we take a look from an education perspective, we're looking at every 3 years there's a study done in regards to who are the top countries for education. Okay.
Right. Okay.
And during this time, Singapore for the last 3 or 4 years was number one in the world in mathematics, science, English, and so forth. And everybody was looking at, what is Singapore doing differently? And what she had found out and what she had noticed is that educators, when they start, so when we say educators now, let's change it to managers. Okay?
Yeah.
When managers start, they are enthusiastic, they may get some training, and they're ready to implement, and getting things done. After 2 to 3 years, they plateau and they go into this daily, regular routine. Why? Okay. When we take a look at the Singapore model, in the Singapore model, what they do is every year there's consistent training on a month-to-month basis. There's even a focus group of teachers coming together, or let's say managers coming together, looking at best practices, where they're not working in silos, they're thinking together and how they can go and improve their individual departments, right?
Sounds a lot like the Kaizen approach there.
Yeah,
right?
They're doing a lot of brainstorming. Yeah. And as a result, those managers or teachers don't plateau. They're growing up and making these changes and developing this mindset. We don't do that with management. We don't do that at all, right? There's just this straight plateau approach.
Actually, we don't do it, but you can tell which companies do, right? Because those companies tend to have lowest turnover. They're considered the best employers, and all that stuff, and the world goes around quickly. So I think we're in agreement, and I think even though I tackle obviously a different side of business consulting, we're both reaching the same conclusion that, train your people, absolutely, but make sure that they have a consistent structure on which they can lay that foundation and maintain. I think curiosity is a skill. We used to call that back when I worked with HSBC, is that curiosity is a skill and you need to massage that skill and grow it, right? And in order to do that, you need to have people with different opinions and all that, and bounce ideas and brainstorm and intellectualize and all that stuff. So glad we're kind of, even though we're both coming from we're attacking the problem from a different side, we're still reaching very similar conclusions, right?
Absolutely.
So you're looking at neurodivergency in particular. That's your niche. That's your speciality. And I'm looking more at kind of the business output out of it, right? But people need to be at the center of your business.
Absolutely.
Regardless of what you do. If your people and your customers are not at the center of your business, it doesn't matter what you're doing.
You're going to suffer.
You're going to struggle. Yeah, you're going to struggle to grow. You're going to struggle to maintain. You're going to struggle to keep people. It's just gonna happen. But I want us to spend maybe the last 20 and 30 minutes moving away from the employer aspect of what you would do from an employer. Focus a bit on our listeners, right? So I'm pretty sure that, or I hope so, that if there are listeners that listening to this particular podcast, this episode, that are or think that they are neurodivergent, I'm going to ask you that questions from their perspective now. Maybe they can, maybe you can help. We can help someone out, right?
Sure.
The whole point of this podcast is to inspire people and to help them out. And
fantastic.
So if I think I'm neurodivergent, right, but I'm not sure, right? So I've not had any official diagnoses. I've not looked into it. I've just been reading, or maybe I've been really struggling at work, or I've always struggled a bit at school with particular things, and I can pick up on that pattern now because I'm a bit older. So I think I'm neurodivergent. What should I do?
Okay, so first off, if you're seeing particular patterns that you relate to in regards to that, chances are you're neurodivergent. Chances are that unfortunately you got missed in the education system and you were never diagnosed. Start off with a self-diagnosis. You know, the studies out there that are showing coming right now is that a lot of these self-diagnoses are actually on par with an official diagnosis, and in some aspects are even better than, because they notice particular traits and recognize particular traits that even fall outside of the DSM model. Okay.
What is the DSM model?
The DSM model states from the, what's the definition for DSM? It's basically the medical journal model stemming from the United States in regards to what are the psychological conditions that are rated by a psychologist in recognizing one's type of psychological development, let's say. So if you're schizophrenic, for example, someone who's a psychologist will refer to the DSM saying, you know, based on these criterias, yes, you have, or no, you don't have schizophrenia. And same thing in regards to dyslexia, ADHD, or what have you.
It's a diagnostic and statistic manual of mental disorders.
Yes, thank you for that.
I googled it, it's not me.
It's very quick. Yes, you have the laptop in front of you, I don't.
Yeah. Sorry, what were you saying? Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah. So let's start off with the self-diagnosis. The self-diagnosis is, again, is on par, and in other aspects is even better than. Now, of course, with that said, you want to go to a legitimate source. Mm-hmm. You know, so you can go to Attitude magazine. They have a number of self-diagnosis tools. You can go to the ADHD Foundation UK. They have a few self-diagnosis tools. There's another one called, I found, which is done by a psychologist who owns the company, Autism something, I can't remember what it's called now, but they have from what I've seen and heard, they have a pretty good self-diagnosis tool. So you want to start from there. Once you have that, if you can, and I say if, and I'll explain why if in a moment, get an official diagnosis. Okay? I'm a big believer in getting an official diagnosis, even though as I said, the DSM doesn't have all the criteria. You know, so if you actually follow some of the neurodivergent community, as I have, they will point out and say, well, why is this not in the DSM model? Why is this not in the DSM model? These are obvious traits for someone who's ADHD or autistic or so forth. And unfortunately, there are certain aspects that have not been recognized.
Okay.
But you still need to get an official diagnosis. For anything, the official diagnosis is for you. Okay, for you to understand what your neurotype is, and also to fill in that piece of the puzzle and finally say, now I understand who I am. And and then of course, unfortunately, you will go through as I went through a few years back with my late diagnosis with dyslexia, 50% dyslexia again, I say, of what's what I'm looking for, diagnosis anger, because you're angry of why was I not noticed 10 years ago or 20 years ago.
I went through that as well. And then sometimes that anger comes back. I'm
it does.
I've wasted so much time,
It hugely does. And I particularly, I'll be honest, I particularly got angry around that time. I was really, really angry because it's like, I'm at this burnout. I'm dealing with this employer and I'm angry.
Yeah.
You know, and on top of that, at the same time period, the Ontario government decided to finally recognize dyslexia in the school systems. And the previous governments prior to that refused to because they said it was too expensive. So that, you know, my generation got missed, you know, or my generation fell into the aspect of general learning disabilities. We don't want to identify it, but it's general, you know. So I didn't get the proper support or understanding that I could have gotten. You can see the anger boiling up, you know,
passion,
angry. So that will happen. Now, I say if because unfortunately it's a cost. You know, you now have to go privately. Or you may have to go private. Malta's a little bit different. In Canada, up until the age of 18, you can get a diagnosis. After that, you have to pay privately. I managed to get re-diagnosed before leaving high school because I knew I would need it. But still didn't quite understand what the diagnosis was because no one properly explained it to me. So if you can afford it. Now, getting a diagnosis can range anywhere from 500 to 6,000, depending on what part of the world you're in. So there is a cost factor, and not everybody's able to afford that cost.
Absolutely, yeah.
So that's where the self-diagnosis comes into play, right? Then you want to devour as much material as you can about your diagnosis. If you see traits that you have autism, and you do the self-diagnosis, and you recognize the self-diagnosis tells you that you're autistic. Start devouring as much material as you can to understand your autism. In particular, understand your executive function. And there's a lot of material out there in regards to understanding executive function. Then from there, you may need a coach or a mentor. You know, in the workplace, the common traits that neurodivergents have, which all falls into executive function, is organization, prioritization, memory, task initiation, even self-regulation. You know, so you may need a coach as well as a therapist who understands, is trained, and recognizes it. Because unfortunately, there are therapists out there, despite their education, will not recognize neurodivergency and just say that, you know, that you're not trying hard enough. You know, and this is why a lot of neurodivergents end up getting misdiagnosed. So when you get the diagnosis, when you decide to get an official diagnosis, you need to find somebody who is specially trained and recognizes that. Now, there's a catch here, and this is where I particularly have a problem, and this is where I say you need a coach. When I went and when I got told that perhaps that I'm dyslexic, I went and looked and see who I can find locally to get me that diagnosis. And luckily I found through a referral that they were doing free dyslexia testing through the education system. So I was able to get in and get my diagnosis. But when I went to all the other aspects, we can provide you a diagnosis, and we can provide you, you know, a letter for your employer for diagnosis, which at the time I wasn't really looking for, but we can't offer you after support. So what's the point? You're offering 50% of the solution, but you're not offering the other 50% of the solution.
We're back to square one.
We're back to square one. You know, and I believe, you know, in my opinion, there's this belief that because you're an adult, you should be able to figure it out. I've been diagnosed since I was a child. I got re-diagnosed twice now, and I'm still trying to figure it out. I still don't have all the answers. I'm still struggling, you know. And this is why at this aspect, you need to find a coach or a therapist who can provide you that additional support. And, you know, particularly you will find neurodivergents, a lot of neurodivergents, such as myself, are coaches. We coach other neurodivergents because we have that lived experience, but as well, we have a better understanding to provide that perspective that you're looking for.
Mm-hmm. Very good answer, I think. You know, and we'll make sure that we include your contact stuff and your contact details and links, etc. in the YouTube channel. So if there is anyone listening that, you know, might think, oh, I need a coach or I need someone to look up to, you know, reach out to Joseph K Muscat. He'll help you out.
Thank you.
What second question, and probably this could be the last one, probably because I think we've answered a lot of really good questions today.
You don't want to go on for another 2 hours?
I would love to. I would love to, but I do need to get home to have some dinner as well at some point. Listen, we can do another episode. We've already talked about this, right? So this is not just a one-time ticket. But no, so if somebody's listening and they know they're neurodivergent, or they think they are, and they've done the self-diagnosis maybe, and they're a bit struggling at work, what would you, and this is from an individual level, what strategies would you recommend for neurodivergent individuals to be able to manage the challenges in a traditional workplace, which we do find a lot, right, in Malta, in terms of the way the day-to-day is undertaken?
Sure. Well, first off, become self-aware. A lot of people are not... Self-awareness is a skill set, and a lot of people haven't really developed the skill set of being self-aware. Look at your particular challenges. Again, it most likely will fall under the executive function, so that requires you to understand your executive function. Up to some point by now, you obviously have developed coping mechanisms. Mm-hmm. Okay? Look at what your coping mechanisms are and see, how you can elevate that to give you the better support. You may need to look for outside support, again, coming back to a coach. You may need to take a look at different strategies. At this point, one of the things you need to do is develop a toolbox that you can constantly go into to pull out additional strategies. Okay? And as I said earlier, you might develop a particular tool that you've been using. And again, you're going to fall off the wagon. All right. When you do fall off the wagon, one, you want to examine what worked, what didn't work, focus on what worked. Because again, how can you make it work for your brain? At the same time, go back to the toolbox. See what other ideas or strategies that you can pull out to supplement or potentially replace the current strategy that you're applying, that you're currently applying. Having that toolbox is really important. Now, the one thing
you also said like when you fall off, and I think that's a really good use of the word when.
Yes,
because it's going to happen.
Yeah,
people will, you will fall off the habit wagon, I guess.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And one of the aspects too is there's a technique that I like to use called the tiny habit approach. Okay, the tiny habits is a fantastic approach, and it's very perfect for neurodivergence. When we take a look at habit forming, okay, we tend to look at a habit and we go all in. And then we fall off the wagon, okay? What we need to do is we need to break down that habit into its smallest components, which again is a common executive function tool to use, breaking down tasks. Break down that task to its smallest components and then start with one, the first part of that task. And then once you've mastered that first part, then move on to the second part. And once you master that second part, move on to the third part. These are, again, strategies that you can apply. And again, breaking down is a huge strategy. One of the things that we haven't talked about, though, because we've been talking about challenges, is focus on your strengths. Learn to identify those strengths. And you may say to yourself, I don't have strengths. You do. You just haven't become self-aware to recognize what those strengths are.
Yeah.
Recognize those strengths, because again, we focus more on challenges than we focus on strengths. Focus on your strengths. Yes, develop the strategies to support your challenges, but then focus on your strengths and elevate those strengths, because that is where you're strong in. So when we take a look at dyslexics, for example, dyslexics are 80% strong in visual thinking. They're about 70 to 80% strong in communication skills. My strength as a dyslexic is my communication skills. I speak quite eloquently. So that is one of my strengths. And I utilize that in my podcasts, in my speaking engagements, in my workshops, as being a guest on this podcast. That's my strength. I communicate very well. Yes, I have organization challenges and prioritization challenges and task initiation challenges. I procrastinate far more than I'd like. Yeah. But once I get in front of a mic, I speak. Focus on the strengths and then try to figure out how you can apply that in your current workplace.
That's very interesting.
Have you been recognized for that? Have you said to your manager, you do know I'm strong in this area. Where can you apply me more in this area?
Which is like, for example, myself personally, having been a while on this planet now, you figure out what your strengths are, and pattern recognition, obviously being able to communicate and speak. It's one of my strengths as well personally, but pattern recognition being probably one of my strong, and like picking up on vibes very quickly. Like I can tell if somebody's in a bad mood, or I can tell if somebody's being disingenuous, or if somebody's not really fitting in. But pattern recognition, being able, which is why I was, I think probably I performed the best when I got into strategic roles, because I can tell, 6, 7, 8, 9 steps down the line if it's going to work or it's not, because I've been experienced it before, which is why I'm very good at video games, or I enjoy being good at video games, but I am good at video games, right? Yeah, but I've always been good at video games. I've competed in video games and I've won, and I've been champion in multiple video games, but it's because of the pattern recognition aspect of it. So absolutely what you're saying, right? Neurodivergency may come with challenges. I think even if you are neurotypical, it may come with challenges, but it's always really important to focus on the strengths and play at them, rather than, I think it's important to know your challenges as well, because there are limitations that you need to be obviously aware of, but playing at your strengths is such a good tool.
It is. And
it's crazy.
And if you don't know what your strengths are and you haven't quite developed the skill of self-awareness, then talk to somebody that you know, who knows you, who will be able to identify your strengths for you. And and in this aspect, coming back to the workplace, managers, colleagues, your team members, what their strengths are. You need to point that out to them as a third party, highlight that, and elevate that. And one of the things, and in regards to when we come back to mental health, there we go, mental health, oh my God, I've lost
awareness.
Self-awareness. No, not self-awareness. Self-image.
Right. Okay. Self-esteem.
Okay. Self-esteem. Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. My dyslexia word bank. I couldn't pull out the word.
We've also been talking for an hour and 20 minutes. The energy level starts.
My energy level. Yeah. But one of the best tools that anyone has, which unfortunately we don't use as regularly and as often, like literally firing the gun as often as we should, is giving recognition. We tend to focus again for every. I learned something quite recently. For every one criticism you give, you need to give 5 times praise. Because we so focus on criticism every time, and particularly in neurodivergent, they're constantly being criticized from a young age all the way into adulthood. We need to start praising more effectively. And there's sufficient studies that those organizations, those managers who constantly praise on a daily basis, productivity skyrockets.
Absolutely. And there's with neurodivergency, there's a bigger sensitivity to rejection, right? So there's rejection sensitivity dysphoria, yeah. So that, and it's like 100-fold, right? So
it's 100-fold.
People like they really, really feel it if you're being rejected. And I think, like personally, for example, I have always like been an overachiever at work, and it's good because I just didn't want to be told, this is not good enough, And it's not the first time I get a piece of feedback, and I feel now I can manage it. But before, it used to like really like it was just a gut punch, like a kidney shot. So it's to those listening that are leaders, do it with everyone, right? Yes, absolutely. Recognition is important. Always sandwich feedback in between recognition.
I disagree with sandwich.
No? Do you disagree with it, really?
Sandwich has actually been shown to be a very poor method.
How come?
Because you're criticizing and then you're praising, and then you're criticizing again.
Oh, no, I know the other way around.
What's the other way around?
So it's recognized. So, for example, you did this really well. This could be better. This is what you can, and also this was really good as well.
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of criticism.
No, okay.
I'm not a big fan at all of criticism. A better approach is feedback.
Yeah.
So you give feedback, you give suggestions. Yeah. That actually goes more well with individuals than the criticism.
So for the listeners, what's the difference between that? So what's the difference between giving feedback and criticism? Because some people think it's the same thing.
It's not. Criticism is where you've done this wrong. Okay? I'm not happy with the outcome of what you've delivered. This is direct criticism. And particularly, when we take a look at criticism also tends to be your personal opinion of how you think the work should have been done differently.
Mm-hmm.
Feedback, though, is literally just giving feedback. You did a great job, and here are some suggestions on how you can make it better for next time. It's a completely different approach, and even the tone is different, rather than saying this was wrong.
Okay, makes sense. Because I mean, I think it also because for me personally, I would rather if somebody's very direct with me. I've always been, but I think maybe the compromise here is have a conversation with your employees and figure out the best way they want to receive feedback as well, right?
Yeah.
Because I've always told them, like, listen, be straight, because otherwise, if you're being overly nice, I'm not going to work on it, right? I need you to be direct with me and tell me exactly what's going on.
You can be direct with the feedback, right?
But it's obviously the tone of voice and all that.
But it's not criticizing.
Yeah.
I mean, yes, you're right in the aspect of you need to learn how the other person wants to receive communication. And that's another aspect as well when we talk about adjustments. So one thing we haven't talked about is accommodations. Yeah. And one of the accommodations...
was going to be my next question.
One of the accommodations is understanding how that person likes to work, how that person likes to communicate, and adjusting to how they like to work and how they like to communicate. So I'll give you an example. One of the challenges I had with my previous employer was the communication style. We were using a project management tool as Asana, and he would list out the instructions, and he was a little bit ADHD, not a little bit, he was ADHD and dyslexic. So I would spend a lot of time, it took him 20 minutes to write it, and I would spend an hour of trying to
deciphering
and frankly correct what he wrote. And then I would come back to him and say, look, I understand point 1 and 2, but I have a few questions about point 3 and 4. What was his answer? I already wrote it for you. Go back and reread it.
Yeah.
If I'm coming to you with questions,
I'm laughing because I've had that experience myself with my team where I'll be like, oh, so what did you mean by this? But I think that's where the self-awareness kicks in. I'm like, I know that I'm going to probably suck at putting it on a piece of paper, because most of the time, like, I'm really good at vocalizing it. Like if I had to motivate my team, it came second nature, right? If I want to make people laugh, I can do that. Like if I want to explain something verbally, I can bring it to life very quickly. But if I'm putting something on a document, I've learned that now, obviously, but if you're putting something on a document quickly, especially, so I think if you are a leader that has ADHD, and I'm speaking from experience, just be vulnerable in terms of, I know I suck at that. So, this is how I can do it better.
But also be flexible to realize that this is something known as certainty and uncertainty. If your team is coming to you, particularly your neurodivergent employees coming to you and saying that I have questions, there's uncertainty there.
Yeah.
You need to rectify that uncertainty and provide certainty by answering those questions and as well listening to where they're coming from.
And that's full circle with the psychological safety, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And if you're not willing to do that, then at the end of the day, as I've done, I said, okay, I've given up. I'll do what I can and then deal with the consequences afterwards, which was you didn't understand my instructions. Well, I did come to you.
I'm very sure that a lot of people right now are thinking, or some people are thinking, especially people that are either employers or managers, and thinking, this is such a waste of time or effort, having to accommodate other people in the workplace. But so is hiring somebody else once that person inevitably is leaving, right? So either you're going to do the work up front and then reap the benefits over the long term, or you're just going to have to every 6 to 24 months have to employ somebody else to do that job, because eventually these people will burn out.
Absolutely. And leave, right? And again, it comes back to a hidden cost.
Yeah.
The cost for accommodations, can cost anywhere from 0 to a maximum of 500 to 1,000 euros. Mm-hmm. Okay. So what's 0? 0 is giving clear communications. Yeah. Right. Adjusting your communication style to how that person receives communications. That doesn't require any kind of costs. When we take a look at providing what would be a cost? If I ask for Grammarly, a yearly subscription for Grammarly is about 324 euros. right underneath the 500.
There's free versions as well, right?
There's also the free version as well. But if you want a more robust system, you provide it. I mean, and that brings up another aspect, but we'll get back to that in just a moment. Very quickly.
Okay.
But the average cost of providing accommodations versus recruitment costs. Okay, so let's say 10,000 euros to recruit someone that you've let go, who you didn't want to provide accommodations to. The average cost is 7% of recruitment, which is about 500 to 800 euros. So out of 10,000, if I did my math correctly. So what's more cost effective to a company? Spending 7% or spending 10,000?
I mean, this data is there everywhere, right? Everyone knows it. It's just, and the very common complaint I hear is like, oh, there's not any good people left to hire. And I'm like, if that's your perception as a leader, then probably maybe you're the problem.
Yeah,
you need
exactly.
to or maybe it's not just you as a leader. It's more maybe the structures and processes and that you've implemented within your business are just not up to scratch anymore. They need to evolve. They need to change to be able to accommodate people better so they can do their job better.
Exactly.
Because nobody shows up to work not wanting to work.
Precisely.
Or maybe they don't enjoy the job, but if they're not enjoying the job, then again, it's your job to figure out why they're not enjoying the job. Is it not fulfilling enough? Is it not challenging enough? Is it too challenging, right? You need to maybe fix some procedures to make sure that there are levers to protect that person or that role particularly from burnout, right? So get some data, make decisions based on that data. But I think it's becoming very common now in the conversations I'm having with a lot of people is that we tend to make decisions based on intuition rather than actually look at hard evidence.
Yeah,
which
exactly.
Is data, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And also too, the aspect is a lot of employers get stuck in this mindset, should I say, of this is how we've always done things, all right? And they're not willing to change. And we know historically, companies have basically fizzled out and no longer exist because of that attitude. Yeah. The work, I talked about language earlier and how language is an ever evolving thing. And people fail to realize that. The workplace is the same. Yeah. It's ever evolving, particularly when we take a look at generation changes, and now we're looking at the aspect of neurodivergency. Neurodivergency has always existed. It's now being pushed to the main front and saying you haven't recognized us, and you haven't transformed the workplace to include us more successfully. And
it could be an advantage. Like if you have enough understanding of neurodivergency, like knowing, for example, that dyslexic people are much more avid visual communicators, then you could easily kind of shift people who are known to be dyslexic within your business to more visual roles like graphic design or data modeling, something like that. I'm just
look. I mean, I tell one of the introductory lines that I use is that I help companies grow and increase their profits by 28% by not recognizing the talent they have within their organization and they're leaving at the door. Because statistically, based on the research, once again, by now I think you've clued in, I'm big on research, is that companies who employ neurodivergents and are more diverse have actually seen an increase in productivity and profits by 28%. So it is to your benefit. It makes good business sense to your bottom line to transform your organization to be more inclusive to neurodivergence.
Very interesting, and that's a good. I think that's a really good figure to close the conversation. One last question, and then we'll move on to the final question I ask all of my guests. But
sure.
One last question for the parents and educators that are listening as well. How can they support neurodivergent children from an early age? So, I think that we may have parents that might have concerns or start picking up on some of their children's behavior, and they want to look up, and I'm sure that there's an element of worry as well. But what ways can they support their children?
Okay, so those are two questions, frankly.
Yeah.
Okay. The first, from an educator point of view, the education system is slightly ahead, and I say slightly ahead of the workplace. And as a result, they need to do a lot more work, from my opinion and my observation. Particularly when we take a look at teachers have been trained by the system and the system hasn't fully embraced neurodivergency. And as a result, the teachers are not fully trained themselves. They don't understand executive function challenges. They don't understand how to fully support. Many think that, by giving students a dyslexia pen, the problem is solved, when they're not looking at the aspect of working memory, organization challenges, self-regulation challenges, and so forth. So teachers need support systems, and they need additional training. And don't get me wrong, I have no problems against the teachers, but they unfortunately are a product of the system.
Yeah.
Parents. There's nothing wrong with neurodiversity.
Yeah.
I work with some schools where they recognize a child has a particular neurodivergency, and the parents they try to communicate to the parents, and the parents are very resistant. Not my child, or my child doesn't behave in this particular way at home, because obviously the child displays differently at school versus class, and there's also masking. Parents need to embrace neurodiversity and recognize that there is a lot of strengths to neurodivergency, and how to better support their child. When you are in denial, unfortunately, you're setting your child to fail as they progress in the education system and into adulthood. One particular interesting aspect is whether the school system missed or whether the parents have been resistant, is that the post-secondary, from the conversations I had with post-secondary experts locally and internationally, are filling in the gap. Students are coming to them with challenges where they end up providing them diagnosis because they didn't get it earlier in life. And then now they're playing catch up. All right. You don't want your kids to play catch up. You want to tackle this as early as possible, be strength focused, and support the challenges. And parents, in addition to that, parents need to teach their kids from an early age to be advocates for themselves. And how can they become advocates for themselves if they don't know?
Yeah. Very good answer. Thank you. Very interesting. It was one of the very answers I did not want to chip in as well, because I was really, really, really engaged there. So captivating response. Thank you. I'll ask you one last question that I ask every guest here, which is, if you had the whole world listening, what would be your one message to the world?
Embrace neurodiversity. Or should I say neurodivergence? Embrace neurodivergence. There are a lot of strengths to neurodivergence. They bring a lot of value to society, to families, and to the workplace.
Good short response. Probably the very original response as well, because usually the other ones kind of meld a bit together. So thank you for that. Joseph K Muscat, thanks for your insights and your experiences, and sharing your life story, and sharing the good work that you do. And I wish you all the best. And hopefully we'll get to see you again.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you. Cheers.